It was a strange stillness that hung in the air that day, not the quiet of peaceful solitude nor the hush of mourning, but a kind of suspended breath, as if the earth itself had paused to watch, to wait, to listen, and at the center of that silence stood four identical young girls, each a mirror of the other, aligned perfectly shoulder to shoulder on a stretch of soft green grass that could have belonged to a public park or a forgotten cemetery, the distinction blurred by the presence of distant gravestones sunken into the landscape and the rustle of tall trees that lined the horizon like silent sentinels. They were dressed in matching light blue sleeveless dresses that shimmered faintly in the daylight, a pastel hue that caught the sun's warmth but held none of its joy, and their long brown hair fell straight and smooth down their backs, parted precisely in the middle, not a strand out of place, as if the wind itself respected the symmetry of their presence. There was something deeply unsettling in how perfectly they stood, not like children at play or even children posing for a photo, but like figures arranged with care for a ritual they themselves did not invent, an unspoken coordination in there, posture and expression that suggested not only sameness in appearance, but sameness in thought, in memory, in something deeper and more ancient than the flesh. And they did not look at one another nor at the man standing a dozen paces to their right, but into the middle distance, their gazes fixed on something invisible to all but them, something only they could see, or remember, or wait for. Their faces were not blank in the way dolls are blank, but in the way oceans are blank still on the surface but vast, unknowable beneath, their small features arranged into a calmness so complete that it invited unease, as if any sudden movement might tear open a curtain and reveal something watching from the other side, something wearing a child's skin not for comfort but for camouflage. The wind was light but deliberate, passing through the trees with the sound of a whisper too low to understand, and the leaves, newly full with summer's bounty, danced gently above the stone path that curved around the girls and led to the place where the man stood. And he, unlike the girls, moved only subtly, the shifting of his weight from one foot to the other, the clenching of a jaw beneath a short, precisely trimmed beard, his blue suit tailored to perfection yet wrinkled slightly at the shoulder as though he had been sitting for too long, or pacing, or wrestling with a decision whose consequences had already begun to bloom around him like slow fire. His blond hair was slicked back, not carelessly but with intent, and he bore the look of a man who had built his life around control, around distance, around things being exactly what they appeared to be, and yet in this moment he seemed to be unraveling, not in the obvious way of weeping or rage, but in a quieter, more devastating fashion, like a structure learning too late that its foundation has been made of sand, and his eyes, sharp blue, unblinking, moved slowly from one girl to the next as if seeking something that could not be found, as if daring one of them to reveal a flaw, a hint, a deviation that might restore his understanding of the world. But none did, and the longer he looked, the more it seemed the sameness of the girls was not natural but imposed, like a rule written, not by biology but by story, by myth, by curse, and still they did not look at him, nor at anything else, simply held that perfect pose as though it were a posture they had been born knowing. And behind them, the green of the grass gave way to the mottled gray of time-worn stones, many leaning or cracked, their names half-eaten by rain and years, marking the ground not as public parkland but as consecrated ground, or perhaps forgotten ground where the living rarely came and the dead never left entirely. The trees in the distance seemed to pull back from the clearing slightly, as if giving the girls space or shielding themselves from whatever it was that had summoned them, and the light, though unbroken by clouds, seemed thinner here, filtered through an atmosphere made heavy by memory or prophecy or dread, and though no sound came from the girls, no whisper, no sigh, their silence was not empty but full, dense with a message no one else could translate, and the man's gaze, once searching, became still, his brow furrowing slightly as if some part of him had recognized something terrible and intimate in their presence, as if the shape of them stirred something he had worked hard to bury, and he did not step closer, did not speak, did not call out, perhaps because he knew that to do so would be to break the spell or reveal a truth he was not prepared to hold in his hands. And so he stood, a statue observing a dream, a man tethered by history to a moment he had not asked for but could no longer escape, and in the heavy hush that settled around them like dust, time itself seemed uncertain of its direction, unsure whether to move forward or backward or simply stop altogether, and in that endless golden pause, the world felt as though it were on the brink of remembering something ancient and impossible, something buried under layers of forgetting and disbelief. Something that wore the face of a child not to soothe but to unsettle, and still the girls stood unmoved, breathing but not alive in the ordinary sense, watching but not with their eyes, and the man remained frozen in his grief, his awe, his fear, a single figure on the edge of revelation or madness, or both, asterisk, and still nothing changed, not a step taken. Not a word spoken, and yet everything within that silence churned and twisted beneath the surface like deep water hiding unseen currents. For though no one moved, the moment itself seemed to evolve, as if the tension between the man and the four girls were expanding, thickening, wrapping around the trees and stones and grass until the air felt close and electric, like the few seconds before a storm breaks open, and within the man's stillness there was a quiet desperation, the kind that lives inside people who have seen something they cannot explain and now must either deny it or be consumed by it. And he looked again at the girls, not out of hope or curiosity, but with the haunted gaze of someone trying to make peace with the impossible, his shoulders rising slightly with a breath he did not know he had taken. A breath that trembled as if holding back more than air, and perhaps in that instant he saw not four girls, but one girl repeated, or one memory, fractured into four living reflections. Or perhaps, more horrifyingly, he saw not a memory at all, but a prophecy. And it was this uncertainty, this absence of explanation that hollowed him out from the inside, for a man like him who had lived his life according to rules and systems, and laws of cause and effect, could not endure the presence of something so symmetrical and yet so wrong, something that violated the logic he had built around himself like armor. And the girls, for their part, seemed not to register his discomfort, did not glance at one another, did not fidget or blink out of sync, but simply remained present, watching, waiting as though they were the ones assessing him, measuring his reaction, determining his worth. And in this reversal of power, something inside the man flickered, an old guilt perhaps, or a recognition long suppressed, and the weight of it pressed into his spine and pulled at the corners of his mouth until his composure began to tremble at its edges. And he looked down for a moment, unable to hold their gaze, though they had not moved, and when he looked up again, it was not with suspicion but resignation, as though he finally understood, on a level that words could not reach, that whatever bound him to these girls had been decided long ago, before names and logic and reason, and that his role here was not to question, but to witness. The sun above drifted slightly westward, casting longer shadows along the grass, and the stones in the distance caught new angles of light, their moss-covered surfaces gleaming faintly like ancient coins scattered across the field, and somewhere a bird called out, sharp and singular, its cry slicing the quiet but doing nothing to shatter the spell. And all at once it became clear that the world beyond this clearing had become irrelevant, unreachable, as though this moment existed outside of time, a pocket carved into the day where reality had bent inward, folding upon itself to trap these 5 figures in an eternal now, and still no one moved, though the wind had shifted and the leaves above had begun to whisper more urgently. And perhaps it was only then, or perhaps it had been true all along, that the man realized he was no longer entirely standing in the world he had come from, that the path behind him no longer looked quite the same, that the air no longer smelled of distant car engines or warm pavement, but of earth, of roots, of something old and damp and buried, and though fear touched the edges of his awareness, he did not flee, did not call out, but stood firm, because somewhere beneath his uncertainty lay a deeper knowledge, a sense that fleeing would not save him, that calling out would not break the spell, because the moment he had stepped into that clearing, he had stepped into a truth, his truth or someone else's, that could not be undone. And the girls, seeing this, though they did not show it, might have softened slightly, their breath drawing in the same rhythm now, their presence no longer confrontational but sorrowful, and the man, as if sensing this change, shifted his weight forward a half-inch, as though about to step closer, to bridge the space between them, and in that subtle motion was everything, the yearning, the regret, the recognition, and it was not clear if he knew why he was here.